When we hear the name Aaron Burr, we think of the musical Hamilton, but we don't really think of the guy who was at one point a vice president or also faced many charges that many call at the time a political witch hunt. Well, where have we heard that term in today's society? With President Donald Trump. And without further ado, I am Juan Collado Díaz, and in this episode of Politico, we're going to be talking to Brennan about Aaron Burr and Donald Trump. Hey everybody, and welcome once again to another episode of Político. I am your host, Juan Collado Díaz, and with me I have Brennan, a passionate author, attorney, and historian who explores the intersection of politics, justice, and history in a unique way, because his ability is to connect historical events with modern-day society and politics. And his work not only invites readers to question the narratives that we see every day, but also creates a thought-provoking conversations through his books and blogs. So without further ado, Dennis, welcome to Politico. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation to be a part of this episode. And can you tell me a little bit about yourself, the book, and what inspired you to write this piece of work that we have never seen before relating Aaron Burr and Donald Trump?
Sure. My name is Dennis Brennan. Wrote the book D.C. Swamp Strikes Back, Aaron Burr, Donald Trump and their similar battles. I'm an attorney, been an attorney for 35 years, former newspaper journalist. I've owned some businesses. I'm a, south side of Chicago kid, grew up in the Chicago area, just outside Chicago in a small suburb. Moved now to the western suburbs, so I've been here my whole life. Went to school here, St. Xavier University for college, John Marshall Law School for law school. And I guess the inspiration was a friend of mine wrote a book about Aaron Burr, and he asked me to read it. I did. I thought it was a good book, but I thought he missed, some similarities between Trump and Burr and how their lives were and the battles they had when in Washington. And when I told him that, he looked at me like I was nuts. He didn't think so. I said, well, then I'm going to write a book. So he kind of inspired me to do it. And I did. And that's where we are.
Yeah, and so the book itself, you can say, but for the time right now, it's a little perhaps controversial. There's Aaron Burr himself was a controversial and still a controversial character in history. I think the Hamilton musical didn't do justice to the character, in my opinion. But not a fan of the musical either. But so I think his story has been changed over time so much by different people. Where some people say by the end of his life he regretted what he did. But then some other people say then he just went with no regrets. So and I think writing about him. Do you had any struggles when you were writing about him specifically? I know with the current president, we know a lot about him, but Aaron Burr, that was so many years ago. So
Yeah.
Do you had any difficulties when you were writing about him and putting this book together?
No, exactly. You're right on point. Much more difficult to capture Burr because we're living Trump, and you can make your own decision on what you think or don't think of him. But with Burr, it was a little bit more difficult because you'll read history books or even just, historical books that break down his life and what he was doing. The musical, sure, that did not make him out to be the star attraction, perhaps a negative outlook on him. And yeah, over history, I think if, most of us, and I mentioned in the book, with Aaron Burr, what you remember is the duel with Alexander Hamilton. That's most students would remember. They'll remember that if nothing else. And most will remember nothing else. They won't know that he was vice president. They won't know the work he did to make sure Jefferson was elected president. They may not even know about what became known as the Burr conspiracy. It was also known as the Spanish conspiracy, and for which he was tried for treason twice over. I think the problem is you had a lot of negative issues surrounding Burr as told by those historians. And, I think you have to really dig, and there's several people that have written books, and I reference them all that I used, about Aaron Burr, looking at it from both sides. I don't know that you could make a judgment. What all I found in the end is he wasn't depicted kindly over history, and that there really wasn't enough evidence to show what some historians have said he had done. And at the end of his life, yes, at one point he joked that he was just ahead of his time. But it really, he had also said several times to his grave after, being acquitted, he could have said anything, that he was not intending to start his own country. He was not intending to go to war, So I found that was the best evidence that, it made it appear, and I think Justice Marshall, who oversaw his treason trial, made it clear you don't have evidence to prove treason. Now, whether he did it or not, it's just like modern day. We look at politicians, whether it's the president or others, and we think in our own minds, I know what he's doing. We may not have evidence, but we think that anyhow. And I think that's something that affected Burr and affected how he's been viewed by historians and unfortunately students who have read about him.
Yeah, and I'm assuming the process to as we just talked, it was definitely hard, the process to find the information, getting put together, because as you literally said, I think that the two main things that I remember was he was a vice president and he had the duel. That was pretty much everything I could remember from him. Compared to, I think other people might remember something more.
Right. And he's kind of a famous vice president because for two things, he tied with Jefferson. It was the first and only time where the president and vice president tied, and the vote went to Congress to decide who'd be president, which sounds absolutely crazy because, that we wouldn't even contemplate doing it that way. We really don't care. They run together now, and president's going to be the president. But they actually changed that afterwards because nobody really wants the vice president to be president, even now. And you look at it and you go, okay, this guy became vice president, but he only had one term as vice president, even though he had a lot to do with Jefferson becoming president. In the time they ran together the first time, Jefferson lost to Adams. And, Burr, instead of, going off and doing something else, he went back to New York, rounded up the votes. He was very influential, making sure people were elected to the state assembly there, because at that time, that's how the electoral votes were calculated. So you wanted to elect those people to have an advantage there. He did, which threw New York over to Jefferson and allowed Jefferson to win the election in the second time out.
Yeah, and that's I went to school and I didn't even know that stuff. Even with a master's degree, I didn't know much of that. I'm a master's in politics, so that's huge to know. And now let me ask you: we have all this info, but why Aaron Burr? You could have choose any individual from that time, but why him specifically?
Yeah, I think because when I read the book about Aaron Burr that my friend had written, I was like, as I'm reading through it, I'm seeing similarities to what was going on with Trump and his enemies in Washington and so forth. And, as I'm reading this and I see, whoa, they had the press against him. Aaron Burr had the press against him. He had all over the country, you had different factions who were aligned with Jefferson's people who were looking to prosecute him. He's being prosecuted in different states. Thinking, wait a minute, this is the same thing that's happening to Trump at this time, without making a judgment at that time whether either one was innocent or guilty of anything they were being charged with. It was just obvious they were both having to deal with a lot of, extraneous matters. So Burr became the centerpiece to compare to Trump.
Now, do you think with the book and the information in the book itself, do you think that people who may think Aaron Burr was guilty, do you think those people would also look at your book and go maybe Trump is guilty because of it, and without even reading it before they do?
I don't know. That's a good question. I did a interview with someone who didn't realize until hadn't read the book and didn't realize until about halfway through that was the point, that the comparison was how they both had to fight the forces. So, I mean, that interviewer actually thought it was the other way around, like Burr's a bad guy, Trump's a bad guy. So we had a little discussion about that. And I think that probably just comes from wherever anymore, how you view politically either man, but most likely Trump. And I thought it was funny because it's like halfway through the interview when she realized, you're not who I thought you were. But we still had a cordial conversation. I just think I see those similarities. There'll be some people that'll even read the book. And I think I say in there at some point, it's not for me to decide. You read it, you decide if that makes sense. And I've had some people tell me, yeah, you make a lot of points I agree with, but I still don't like Trump. And I just don't buy it. And that's, it's been, 10 years where we've had, I think, Trump really is the major figure, right? If certainly in this country, if not the world, he's been bigger than life. So people have opinions of him one way or the other, and they think they know whether he's been done wrong or whether he's, a victim. One guy told me flat out he didn't want to interview me because Trump's not a victim. I'm like, well, read the book and we could still discuss it, but he didn't want to. So I think that's a loss. You have to reach across and talk to people. You have to look at it and say, yeah, there's some things I agree with. Maybe you agree with everything, maybe you don't, but at least you look at it and say, hey, I think this you got wrong. It's just like I looked at my friend's book and I said, hey, great book, love it, except I think you missed something. Of course, the book would have been much bigger. So, maybe that's a good reason not to do it. Let me do it.
No, yeah, exactly. And I think, I think one of the things that we, in this current society that we're living in and the state of politics itself, I think it's a great idea to always look at everybody's point of view in a respectful way. I may not agree with everything you wrote in the book, but I may agree with some of it. And then at that point, we have some common ground. We just look at it as like, why not just look at that common ground instead of looking at everything else we disagree? And I always say, if we all work together, we can get a common goal, even when we have 99% of disagreeing views. That like 1% of agreements can get us to a common goal, and that's that's huge in this, especially as I said, in this day and age where people are just arguing over politics, not wanting to interview someone in their podcast because of it and stuff like that. I think, and I think that's when, like, this podcast myself, I created it for that reason. I wanna bring everybody's voice together, but I want to bring those voices out to the world. I want people to be able to express who they are, no matter their political affiliation or who they are. And, and that's the goal. The goal is to give a voice to people that those mainstream media, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, like, they would not give you a voice. And I think I want to give that voice to those people. Then those platforms won.
No, I think that's perfect. And it's like, one of the books behind me up there is about Ronald Reagan, and Reagan had cautioned his own party members that if you get someone to agree with you 80% of the time, that's a friend. Now I think fast forward to present day, and most people in either party will say, no, 80% is not good enough. Well, I need you 100% of the time voting the same way I am, which is very difficult and kind of removes the idea that we have representatives from different parts of the country. They all come in with different views. We, like I said, we might agree on everything except one thing. I would say we're political allies. Then, I'd say Reagan was right. 80% is pretty darn good. But I think he was cautioning people that, might have been, against those that were pro-choice at the time, like, well, they should be out. Well, they're agreeing with everything else we're doing. Let's stay with them. And I think both parties they've created this problem where, unless you toe the line totally, you're out. And they'll have these, money has infested it where they'll do primary challenges, and it makes it very difficult for the center, anybody to be in the center. They're soon ousted from, their position, and especially the way the districts are written, right? So if you're in a Democrat district, you appeal to the farther people on the left, they come out to vote. Same thing in the Republican districts. You appeal to the right, they come out to vote, or maybe now it's even the Trump MAGA group. But whatever the case, that takes away those center people that were the compromisers and the deal makers, and perhaps move government forward. You wouldn't have a shutdown going on if you had all the center
exactly.
people.
I think I have interviewed in the past, like 3-4 interviews that I've done. I've talked to people who are in the center, and they were in the center for so long that now, when they're trying to like look at change and look at things, they're a little confused, and they're like, okay, now I don't know where to go. And I have many Republicans and Democrats who were like strong, strong leftists and like far right conservatives, and they did not want to be part of those anymore. They just wanted to like move away from their parties, and they became like independents, and they started their own independent nonprofits to like encourage other voters. And I think that's been the problem, like, where people are too far into their parties, where they don't see outside of it. And that brings, and that also brings me to the media part. And I think that brings us to another question. Like, you use the term dem media, DEM media. So to refer to the media itself. And I wanted to know if you can explain, the reason why you call the media, the current media itself, you use that term for them.
Yeah. I mean, the problem is there's the most recent survey, I believe, had 97% of reporters and news people, that's not even counting the people running the organizations, that identify themselves as Democrats. And we can debate whether you should ever be identifying yourself with either party when you're a reporter, because, you're supposed to be unbiased. But I think a lot of us have grown up seeing the media go a certain way. And I know everybody on the left refers to Fox News and now Newsmax and others. The conservative side have started a lot of their own, right, conservative publications, news channels, so forth, and conservative radio. And you go back to Rush Limbaugh. But the problem is that's divided everybody more. I think the Dem media, if you look at ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, MSNBC, and the major newspapers, the, New York Times, the Washington Post, even the Chicago Tribune now, and the LA Times, they're all Democrat papers. And it's not only ownership, it's the reporters. And unfortunately, on TV, I'm not sure we're even getting reporters. We have George Stephanopoulos doing ABC's weekly show and the morning show. George is not a reporter. He's a political advisor. He was a good political advisor, but he shouldn't be out there holding himself out as a journalist. It does a disservice to journalism in general. And the way I learned journalism was, it's supposed to be straightforward news stories. You do the 5 W's, the 1 H, and those are supposed to be part of the story. Today, I have the Tribune, Chicago Tribune, sent to my house. I can pick up any story. You won't find that kind of unbiased look at it, but you will find the reporter's opinion somewhere in there, or something that's not even factual. It's their opinion of what's fact. And that becomes a problem. And I suspect, besides the fact a lot of people haven't grown up with newspapers, I think a lot of people have just turned off news. There's a very low percentage of people that find it credible, and especially so Republicans don't. Even though, let's face it, Fox News started basically to counteract some of that, and for money, it was a good money idea for Rupert Murdoch. I think overall he's looking to make money on his businesses, but it was a way to do that, to put a light on the conservative viewpoint. But that's not necessarily good for news either. I guess you're balancing it in the overall scheme if people are looking at all those things. But how many of us, watch MSNBC and Fox, or read the New York Times and the New York Post? Probably not a lot of people.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I myself, I would say, I think newspapers are slowly dying for that reason. It's because bad journalism has taken over. I remember myself when I was a kid, in the early 2000s, newspapers were in this like opinionated on someone's like, base opinion. And I think when you're doing that, you're just creating a blog. It's less of a newspaper, it's less of a news story, it's a blog. I have my personal blog where I share my personal stories, and I share like my opinion on things. That's my blog. I cannot say that I'm a journalist when I'm writing that. Though I do some journalism, I don't think that blog specifically classifies me as a journalist for that reason. I think it's huge to understand that division. That now everybody who thinks they want to write their opinion on a piece is like, I'm gonna go and study journalism, and they forget about the basics. And it is report the truth and nothing but the truth.
And I think, like when I was in school, they did teach us, who, what, where, when, why, how, and that's the story. Now, the students to come out say they're advocates. It's advocacy journalism. The journalism schools are letting us down too, because you shouldn't be teaching people to be advocates. The advocates are the people that run the campaigns, right? If you're doing the political literature, you're doing the commercials, God bless you. That's important too. And I think that goes to my point with George Stephanopoulos. It's like, that's your lane. Don't be coming over into the journalism lane where they're supposed to be real journalists, because you're not. You're a political guy, and you can make your living that way and serve different presidents and so forth. And that's what he should be doing. But it's become a big moneymaker to be a so-called journalist and to advocate for one party or the other. These guys make a lot of money to do that.
No, yeah, exactly. And at that point, before I move to the next question, we can just create a podcast like I did. I want to talk politics with people. I want to share political spectrum views from all around. A podcast is a great, perfect way to do that. And it goes back to like yourself. You wrote a book. People can just write a book maybe instead of just going and doing journals. Write a book. Share your opinion on a book. I think there's many books that are just literally an entire opinion base. I read a couple books on different politicians, and they're just purely just political, like propaganda or just someone's opinion piece. I remember my first year of college, I did a report on Bernie Sanders, and I got a book, and it was just an opinion base on how Bernie Sanders was this great guy. And then I got another one, and it's like an entire opinion based on how he's an awful guy. And I'm like, is there a good book that is not his biography or like, autobiography that can explain to me who this guy is without me having to use Google? And I couldn't find a book that gave me that much. It wasn't his biography or like autobiography. So I was like, damn, I have to go around and try to find myself, then Google it and try to, to find some sources that are more credible than what I'm looking here. Right. I think that's a good part. When you write a book, you can either write a book that is sourceful and credible, or you can just throw your entire opinion piece on it, and pretty much nobody cares because it's a book. It's your book. You made it. You did it. You're not taking over someone's like position or someone's like television to tell them your opinion.
Right. And I think that's why in my book, I tried to make sure I cited sources. I don't know how many people are going to look up sources to see, wait a minute, did he get this right or wrong? But, I do think it lends credibility if you go and do it that way, because I didn't make it up. Now, sure, maybe it's interpreted in the words where you say, well, I don't read it exactly that way. Burr's a terrible guy, or, I think Trump is, or whatever, or I think he's great. So, yeah, it's much better if you can. I think you're right. There's a lot of advocacy going everywhere. And I think I do make the point, talking about the Dem media, that a lot of that's being challenged with podcasters, bloggers, independent. It's not just Fox News that took on, the media and created their own. You have so many other outlets. And, Elon Musk says we are the news. Yeah, you look at X, or, what was Twitter, and people are on there, breaking news now. And it's, and who are they? There's someone that has a Substack column, or, they're not Walter Cronkite or, some, journalists like Mike Royko in Chicago was. Now it's anybody could be a journalist in a way because they have the outlets through technology of podcasting, blogging, basically anything. Vlogging, I guess. You can go on and I see people on YouTube interviewing people on the street. It's journalism in some form, whether you like it or not.
No, yeah, exactly. It's journalism, but not the unbiased journalism we need, sadly, in this society. And that's where, I go back to books. I trust books more than anything because once they're written, it's really hard to just get a book off the shelf and try to change it. Like, you can try, but you're not going to get rid of all the copies. Like, I'm a huge fan of Agatha Christie, and most of her books over time have been changed to modify the language or anything. But I still have many copies of the original versions for that reason, because I know then the modified copies may delete something or may just take an entire part out and change it with something else. And I think that's huge. And, that takes me back to your book. We're talking about Aaron Burr and Trump. And one of the things that, I wanted to go over is the most obvious similarities between them. What do you think they are? And what do you think, your readers may look at those, similarities to be?
I think, they both came into office as outsiders. Trump hadn't held office at all. Burr had, but it was a legislative position and he wasn't there for long. And, they both went to Washington, maybe not realizing that you have to have allies, but you really aren't going to have friends. And Trump, I think, found out in his first term that, relying on others to decide who should be in your administration and not having your own group is a detriment, because even your own people can stop you from moving the way you want to move. Burr found out that, the people from Virginia, Madison, Monroe, that they had their own plan to have the Virginia presidency go on and on. Burr was kind of in the way. He was the New Yorker. Him and Trump both are, kind of brash New Yorkers. And Burr was coming in from the outside. So while they needed him for the votes, they really didn't want him for the future. And they were always working against him. I think Trump himself in his first term had people in his own administration working against him. And that's a problem for both guys. Obviously, as we move on, and in the book, we talk about, what's known as lawfare now. Both men had to deal with their own cases, and, charges varying from treason for, Burr, which is obviously the most serious. We now have this tendency for political enemies to charge everyone like, you're committing treason, it's treasonous. But, I lay out the definition. It's very hard to get to treason, and it's harder to convict. We don't convict that many people. And I think that's the problem, his enemies, that Burr's enemies had, and just like Trump's enemies. If they did anything, you have to charge them with the right crime, so to speak. People won't buy into it, and the court system won't buy into it if you can't actually enunciate the right charge and link it to the actions that they take. So, and both men, Burr, did he do something? He had conversations maybe, but I think the evidence showed, and the fact they couldn't produce two witnesses, you need two witnesses for treason to place him in a conversation about it to get the conspiracy. They couldn't do that. And that's where it all falls apart. That's where I, think he was mistreated because, he's charged, nowadays generally federal government charges you. They've done a lot of work to get there, and they have a heck of a record. They're in the 92% or so on convictions. So if you're charged in a federal crime, well, you're better making a deal rather than trying to go to trial. Trump had charges federal and state, but so I think this idea that they not only had these charges, but there also seemed to be a lot of moving parts, like, Trump in 4 different places. Burr, was charged in New Jersey with the murder of Hamilton. He beat that, even though he did kill him. And he was charged in Missouri and back in Washington for treason. And, when you're moving a guy around and it just comes off as, lawfare. And in both cases, there's charges that the president at the time, Jefferson back then, and Biden. And when I say Biden, or, with Jefferson, there's enough authors who say he was personally involved, that he was actually directing a lot of the litigation or criminal charges. With Biden, I'm not sure if he was personally in charge, but now the administration's so big, he knew of it. His administration was involved, and that's, roughly the same thing.
Yeah, and one term you mentioned is, you talk about lawfare, and I wanted to ask, where do you see lawfare going in like our politics here in the U.S., and not just politics, but also the government itself, like in the next 5-6 years?
Yeah, I fear that it's going to become more and more prevalent. I feared it when they started charging Trump at all, because over the course of time, like Nixon was given a pardon, but part of that was Gerald Ford saying that the country can't go through that. We can't be charging a president or a former president with crimes. It's a bad look, but it's also bad for our stability as a country. Trump made similar comments when a lot of the lock her up idea, when it came, he's the one that was doing it, but then when he was elected and people were saying, well, are we charging Hillary? His answer was no, it wouldn't, we're not doing that. It wouldn't look good for the former first lady to be charged with a crime or go to prison, even if we think there's crimes committed. And I think sometimes that is in contrast to what American people think, right? We think we hear that no one's above the law and whatever, but over the course of history, there have been a lot of people above the law, and they've gotten away with things just because of their position. And we've accepted that because for the stability of the country. Unfortunately now, I think once Trump was charged, and a lot of the people around him, were charged with crimes, some convicted, that was not forgotten by Trump's people, the Republican Party as a whole. And now you have the counter charges that perhaps that same thing's happening with Comey, John Bolton, and Letitia James. So if they are, my hope is if they're charged, you have ironclad evidence, right? That we see James is now indicted. Hopefully there's ironclad evidence, so there's no question where there were too many people, I think, and I go through it in the book, where Trump is charged in the document case, for paying his attorney to pay Stormy Daniels, and they turn it into a felony by some nebulous language to say it should have been reported as a campaign contribution. It's like, you're stretching this a little bit. And, I think the American people look at that and say that, well, obviously they looked at it and said that's not a big deal because they elected the guy, no matter how many times they would say he's 32 times a felon or whatever the argument was. The American people decide ultimately. And I think that's why we've stayed away from lawfare. But as both sides, act like children and decide, well, they did it first. It's like, I get in a fight with my brother and you run to my mom and say, well, he did it first. It's like, it's too childlike. And hopefully someone stops that. Or like I said, I get it. If they're real crimes, you've got to put it forward and convict someone, but you better make sure you have evidence. It's a higher standard, I guess.
No, exactly. I think I remember when I was a kid, I used to with my siblings. So one of them did something and then I did it, and my mother used to caught us, and it was, why do you do it? And I'm like, well, my brother did it. And she goes, well, if he jumps off a bridge, are you jumping with him? And I go, no. And she said, then there you go. That's your answer. You shouldn't have done it.
Yeah.
So, now my brother's free, for a minute, because he already got his punishment, but I'm getting punished for doing the same thing.
Right.
And I'm like, oh no. So, it's like, just because the other side do it doesn't mean we have to ourselves do it. And that's, I think that's in part of what we're seeing. And, over time we have seen a division that is because one party did it, now we have to do it too. And it's like, we can back off of that.
And I think both, we talked about those extremes on the left and the right. They look at it like, well, if you don't, we're coming after you because, you're doing it, you're playing to your base, and the base and the Dems is the left and the Republicans, the right. And, everything's centered to them, not the people in the middle who are saying, I prefer we weren't going after everybody. I'm assuming there's people, that were in the Democrat Party saying that. I didn't run into a lot of them, but I'm sure there are some that were saying, we shouldn't be charging a president. And you start looking at these classified documents, it comes out Pence had some, Joe Biden had some. And I start thinking, I think maybe we're classifying too many documents. Maybe that's the problem, to where all these guys think, oh, big deal, it's classified. That's just to keep us, the public, from looking at it. We know it's not really top secret. It's just stuff we don't want the public to know.
Yeah, and with that, I'm coming closer to here. One of my last questions for you that I wanted to ask you is, when do you think politics in the U.S. itself will change for the betterment of the people? Where the elected officials, the people that we put in there, because we have to be honest, also it's not just we put them in there, but we also pay their salaries. Their $100,000 a year salaries, expensive people. When do you think they're gonna change for the betterment of us, the people of the United States?
I think it's all tied together, and that's why I touch on the media in the book too, because I think the media has this position, where they were always, the referee, right? They would, under the old system where it's real journalism and you had a different balance in the newsroom. You had some Republicans, some Democrats. Nobody cared how you voted. But now we don't have that, and we have an echo chamber. And I think the media has an important position, in the whole society, the whole republic, right? And if they sit there and call penalties on both sides fairly, you'll make both sides move closer to the center, and you'll educate the public more so that it doesn't become a sport. I mean, I'm referring to it like it's a football game, and in fact, it's kind of how it's become. Can I knock this guy out, out of the game? Can I, it really becomes a physical battle where you just are hating the other side rather than saying, well, we meet in the middle and we can discuss, certain issues and get certain things done. Yes, we know you're going to try to put through things that aren't going anywhere, and we're going to do the same. But now you're getting points for being dishonest and for, you can, there's an example. Who's the candidate in, I think it's Virginia, the attorney general candidate, who had made some text years ago about killing the Speaker of the House, shooting him 2 bullets to the head. If he had Hitler and him and someone else.
Yeah, it's part of it's a joke from The Office, actually. Yes, I do remember seeing that. It's pretty much a joke. Michael Scott said in The Office that if Toby was in a room with Hitler, Bin Laden, and Toby, and he had a gun with 2 bullets, he would shoot Toby to the head twice. And I think that joke was made, and now it's coming back up, and that's also another thing. We just dig so far back to and it comes to that dirty politics. It's one message from X amount of years ago. It don't matter now. People change their opinions all the time. People change the way that they speak. People change, people change. It's part of being humans. We are humans. If we didn't change, that would have been very odd.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we all change a little bit. Yeah, I mean, you have some people who are really liberal when they're young and then become more conservative. And I've seen vice versa, where people are conservative and as they age are becoming more liberal. I don't know if it's a self, interest issue where it's well, I can benefit by becoming more conservative or more liberal. But, I've changed myself. I started I came in a Democrat family. Dad was a precinct captain for Cook County Democrats, which is, very, very Democrat. And, now I'd say I voted Republican for I don't know how long. But so, I mean, people do change. They change their opinion on issues. And to some extent, the parties change too. The Republicans have probably become more conservative. The Democrats more liberal or progressive. I'm not even sure. But yes, and you are held to a standard, but you have to get, the media has to jump on things and be fair about it. If they hold everybody to account, and I mean everybody, it can't be just the people you don't like. It has to be everybody. Then you'll have everybody back in the right place. I think Trump has kind of driven the media out of importance, where Republicans especially don't trust the media. But overall, even, most voters don't. And I think that's some of their own doing, because they took on people to fight, and then he just took the fight right to them. So hopefully, though, someone will fix the media first, and that might fix our politicians and our voters.
Yeah, I think that's hopefully we can make that happen in the next, like at least in the next election. Between this and the next election, I hopefully hope to see some change in our political arenas out there. So now I wanted to ask, before we finish, if people wanted to purchase the book or find the book, how can they do that?
Yeah, I have a copy right here. I always carry it. It's D.C. Swamp Strikes Back, Aaron Burr, Donald Trump, and their similar battles. It's available on my website, which is authordennisbrennan.com. It's also sold on Amazon's website, Barnes & Noble. There's supposedly 50 other locations, as they say, where all fine books are sold. So I should be able to pick it up. And it's available in ebook form, paperback, and hard copy.
All right, and for those listening from home, that would also be linked on our website at www.politicopod.com, and you'll be able to see it with the episode show notes. And then I wanted to also ask you, if people wanted to, find you online, where can, they get in touch with you, social medias or anything like that?
Yes, I'm on X, Dennis Brennan at Dennis Brennan 61. I'm also on Facebook, and those. And I don't remember the actual address for the Facebook one, but that's available also. If you just look up Dennis Brennan, you'll find it.
All right. So I wanted to thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a very, very educational, talk. I actually did not know that much about Aaron Burr, and I feel that I'd know at least more than what I knew when I came in here, which is great. And I wanted, thank you for taking your time to express your voice and your opinion through your book, but also to join podcasters, even if some of them refuse to talk to you, I'm still happy that you joined me and we were able to have this conversation.
I appreciate you having me and having an open mind to hear what I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Político with Juan, Collado, Díaz. If you like what you're hearing, you can follow us on Instagram at @politicalpod. Or if you want to see the show notes for this episode and all other episodes, you can go to www.politicopod.com. This and all episodes of Político are part of the Inquisitor Media Originals.